May the Lord give you his peace, Father David Mary here. We're class number 17, plugging along with the life of St. Francis. We're now in the year 1212. We're going to go now progressively, 1 year at a time, looking at Francis's life and the development of his life. It's interesting to note that we haven't mentioned much about animals or nature yet, have we? That's because none of that appears in the first 20-something years of the life of St. Francis. And so you're going to hang on until we get to the animal stories. So, in the year 1212, Francis began a preaching tour of many Italian regions. In Tuscany, he established many houses and hermitages. And at Florence, he received many men into the order, notably Fra John Parenti, who was a doctor of law, who was destined to become a future Minister General of the order. At Pisa, he received Albert, another future Minister General of the order. It's a very significant time of men who are entering the order in this year 1212, when the order is only 3 years old. So that Lent is when Francis spent the whole of it on the Isola Maggiore, on the island of Lake Trasmine. So on that island for 40 days, he fasted on no food for the entire 40 days. Remember, he brought the 2 loaves of bread with him. He didn't touch it until the very end. And he ate half a loaf so as not to grow in pride. And so that happened in the year 1212. After that, he went on to preach at Cortona. And this is possibly where Brother Elias of Cortona entered the order, which is kind of a, slight possibility. I mean, Elias was known to be an Assisian. However, he is known as from being from Cortona. But that's pretty much because he was buried in Cortona. But in any way, it was about this year that Elias entered the order as well. When Francis went to Sartiano, he underwent a temptation to abandon the life of penance. This actually becomes a very difficult year for Francis. There'll be twice that he is tempted to abandon the life of the friar minor, and even a temptation to go off and just be a hermit. So this is a very serious time of discernment for him in many ways. The order is 3 years old, and yet now he's experiencing temptations to abandon this life the Lord had given to him. So just because we may have done sufficient penance for our past sins, and we might be in our vocation, it doesn't mean we're not going to experience serious temptations to leave our vocation. And those temptations are real. Those temptations appear as a good, and may even appear as God's will for us. But again, in the end, they're temptations if they're contrary to the way God has worked in our past. And so Francis really had a hard time. And during the summer of that year, he scourged himself bloody, and that didn't work. And then this was the winter. He did that first in the winter. And that's when he threw himself naked into the snow, and he built 3 snowmen. And he said, "Okay, Brother Ass, here's your wife and children. Now go get a job and feed them." And so he had to kind of wake himself up to this temptation. Now, Francis was not being tempted by lust. He was being tempted by the beauty of marriage. That this is something beautiful, something good, something God created, something God gave to us, something God raised to the level of the sacrament. And Francis is being tempted to abandon the life of penance to go and get married. So, this happens to many religious, and it happened to St. Francis himself. But St. Francis was able to recognize this as a temptation. And, he did various things to try to shake off the temptation, but it didn't work. It wasn't until he threw himself into the snow naked and built those 3 snowmen and kind of woke himself up to the reality that he was able to shake it at that time. This temptation will come back again in another instance. So at this time, Brother Bernardo Quintavalli was sent to Bologna. And Bologna was the center of intellectuals and universities. So Bernard was not accepted, and he was made sport of there. And eventually he became revered as a saint. So when he first got there, everyone made sport of him, and he loved it. And when they started revering him as a saint, he's like, "That's it, I'm out of here. I don't want to be revered as a saint." His humility would not allow that. So he begged Francis to remove him and release him from his duties and send him elsewhere. And St. Francis did, and others were sent to Bologna instead, and Bernardo was sent somewhere else. So St. Francis saw himself and his mission as that of the herald of the divine Redeemer. He was the herald of the divine Redeemer. Isn't that a beautiful title? Herald of the divine Redeemer. And when he delivered his message and won men to Christ-like life, he must leave it to others, he said to the clergy, and rulers of the earth to organize and govern Christ's kingdom. So his job was to go out, to bring people to conversion, and then pass them off to the local clergy to assist them in the growth in their spiritual life. And this becomes very much part of the charism of the Friars Minor. Our mission is to go out and bring souls to the church and then allow the church then to raise them. It's not our job to be running the parishes and doing that type of work. That's the work for the parish priest. The Franciscan work is to bring the people to conversion and then lay them at the feet of the church. When he preached, Francis preached on vice and virtue, punishment and glory. He didn't get into doctrinal sermons about this or that. He preached on the vices and the virtues. You know, the 7 vices, the 7 virtues, and the punishment and glory accordingly. We live a life of virtue, glory. We live a life of vice, punishment. And so Francis was very strict about that, preaching on those titles, and told the brothers that's what we were to preach on. His sermons were simple and to the point. They were aimed at the conversion of heart, and he exhorted the people to do penance. Francis's ideal wasn't just to give them an intellectual knowledge of God. He wanted to get to the heart. He wanted to bring the heart to God. He wanted to bring people to love God with their whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. He wanted them to turn from the life of vice and that road to punishment, and to turn to the road of glory and to a life of virtue. So Francis had a great desire to convert the infidels, or the Muslims. And this took him to Ancona on a boat to Syria. So because he was going to go with a few of the friars, they were going to preach to the Muslims to try to bring them to conversion, and it would possibly have ended in martyrdom. Now the boat was sent off course by a storm and landed in Dalmatia. And as a stowaway, he returned to Ancona. And en route, there was provisions ran short of for the crew, and Francis appeared out of hiding and shared his provisions, and all went well for the ride home. So it was rather a busy time there where Francis trying to get to, and just can't get to the Muslims. When you think about it, it was rather risky. Here is Francis, just founded the order. The order is only 3 years old, and he's already risking his life as a martyr. He really didn't see himself as that important to the full life of the community. Perhaps he thought the community could do better without him if he got martyred, or he could do more for the community from the glory of the kingdom of heaven. Now, Francis had a great desire to bring the gospel to the infidels, and as I mentioned, it'd be odd that he risked his life to do so. But he thought that God would just raise up another if he could only suffer for Christ. So all of Francis' attempts to evangelize the Muslims will seem fruitless of their purpose, and yet it will set a new policy toward the Muslims. The infidels were considered an evil race to be conquered. The Crusaders saw them as enemies. Francis saw them as men in need of conversion. It was this idea of converting the infidels by the sheer power of the gospel lived out that Francis brought to the church. He sent friars out to the lands beyond Christendom in poverty, without weapons, without diplomacy, like the disciples in the first days of the church. So Francis sent his friars out. They went without papers, they went without weapons, nothing. They went to the Muslim people for the simple purpose of bringing them to faith, with the hope that in proclaiming the gospel, they will receive the gospel and turn to the gospel, turn to the waters of baptism, and enter into those waters becoming children of God and not merely servants of the Lord. Francis's gift to the church on evangelization was the reintroduction of enthusiasm for the conversion of the infidels, as opposed to the conquest in the name of Christ. So Francis's gift was that, reintroduction of evangelization, as opposed to conquest when it came to dealing with the Muslim people. Now let's go on to the year 1213. Francis is torn now between the apostolate and the life of a hermit. I should back up, by the way, and say in 1212, that's that St. Clare began her order. It was in August of that year where Francis began her life. And we'll talk about St. Clare in a separate time, but that was in the year 1212. Now, 1213, Francis is torn between the apostolic life and life of a hermit. So that early question that Francis had when they were coming back from Rome, and should they be hermits, should they be active, they thought it was settled. And for most guys it was settled, but not for Francis. It wasn't settled yet in him. You still see this unrest in him of how he should be living out his life. He had that struggle in the year previously with that temptation to get married, and he threw himself into the snow. And now we have this temptation to go forth to go into the life of a hermit. So he sent Brother Maceo to St. Clair to Brother Sylvester, who was living as a hermit on Mount Liverna, in order to ask them what he should do. What was God's will for him? So when Maceo came back, Francis knelt down, crossed his hands over his chest, and was ready to receive whatever Clare and Sylvester said. And they basically said the same thing, that Francis's vocation was to go forth into the world and to preach the gospel for the salvation of souls, for that the grace of the vocation was not given for himself alone, but also for the saving of others. So Francis is now sent out to go preach. And at that moment he rejoiced, took Brother Maceo, Angelo Tancredi, and the three of them went out preaching. And so he heard the word of God through Clare and through Sylvester, and he went. Notice what he did. He sought out two people he truly trusted and asked their advice in their direction and received that as the word of God and was obedient to that word. So during this year of his life, Francis began to relate with wild nature on another level. This is the year that the nature things begin to happen. Notice it's not Francis going out looking to pet birds and pet wolves. This is something that's happening to him as a result of his growth in holiness towards God. It was as if he had re-entered the Garden of Eden. Fear between he and creatures was becoming unknown. So much had he been restored to his original innocence. It was as if he had not sinned. It was as if original sin had not been there. It was as if he was walking in the garden with Adam prior to the fall. This is when we hear the stories of the birds quieting and being preached to at Bavania. Francis is trying to pray at his office, and they're making the noise. He asks them to be quiet. They quiet down, then he preaches to them. This is when we have the stories of the swallows singing in Alviano. And this is where we have the story of the wolf of Gubbio. This wolf that was going through the city of Gubbio. It was eating children and so forth, a wild thing. And Francis goes out, encounters the wolf, and strikes a deal that if they feed the wolf will protect the city. And that deal was struck. He lifted his paw, they shook hands on it, and the wolf became the protector of the city. You may chalk it up to pious legend, but if you go to Gubbio, you'll find a sarcophagus in the church where that wolf is buried. So some things that are pious legend aren't so pious to the people who live through it. So this were the events that caused his popularity to grow quickly. These animal stories began to circulate quickly, and people began to realize, oh my goodness, this man is truly holy, because even animals don't fear him. So when he traveled through the marshes of Ancona, people came out to take relics of him. Many miracles began to be worked through his intercession. So this isn't only the time where we see the animals responding, now we see miracles happening through his intercession. It wasn't like miracles were happening when he was a little boy, or happened right away during his conversion, immediately after his conversion. It's not until 4 years after he begins the order and he's growing in holiness of life and a life of deep and rich prayer, growing in holiness and virtue, that the Lord begins to respond to his prayers quickly, and he becomes a vehicle of God's grace in the most incredible and powerful way. Some simply had to touch the hem of his habit and they were healed. And so if you go to the testimony of Thomas of Celano on the miracles, his treatise on miracles, you'll see many of the miracles that are there. Magnificent. So certain towns began to ring the church bells when St. Francis would arrive in town. And because he was coming in town, they'd ring the bells, the whole crowd would come out and be present to him, and it was magnificent. In other places, the whole of the city would go out to meet him as he approached. Even the heretic Patarini, who were strong in numbers in those parts, respected his preaching. And these heretics did not oppose him. Though in opposition to their doctrines, he was at pains to impress upon his listeners the duty of obedience to Rome and respect for priests. So these other heretics wouldn't even stand toe-to-toe with Francis. They were kind of afraid to. And even though Francis would come in there, he wouldn't kowtow. Francis would preach obedience to Rome and obedience to priests. And so heretical priest was brought to Francis, and Francis converted him. This is the time we have that one of those heretical priests who is living a bad life, and the people bring him to Francis, hoping Francis is going to scold him. And Francis kneels down in front of this priest, kisses his hands, and says, whether you're a saint or sinner, I don't know. All I know is from your hands alone can I receive my Lord in the Holy Eucharist. And that converts the man, and his life is changed forever. So, once again, Francis tries to reach the infidels. He tries to go out to the Muslims again. This time it was to the Moors in Spain. And the Moors have been defeated by the Christians in Las Navas in Spain. So Francis sought to seize the opportunity to convert the Moors. So St. Francis took Brother Bernardo de Quintavalli and a couple of other friars and intended to cross over to Morocco. He was so eager to reach Morocco that his companions could not keep up with him. He seemed intoxicated with the Spirit, as St. Bonaventure said. By the time he reached Spain, he was fatigued and terribly ill. He could go no further, and as soon as he was well enough, he headed back home to Italy with his companions. So you see, Francis could be a bit impulsive. Had he taken his time, he would have made it there okay. But what did he do? He's running ahead, he's rushing, he's got that impulse going, and nothing happens. His companions are exhausted, he's sick, and they got to go back to Assisi. On his journey home, he stopped at St. James Compostela, and he was consoled by a revelation there. So remember, St. James Compostela is a beautiful shrine in Spain built in honor of St. James the Apostle, St. James the Greater. St. James is buried there. And Francis went to that shrine, was deeply moved by the beauty of the shrine, the presence of St. James. And Francis was consoled by the Lord telling him that he would establish many friaries on the way home and that he would receive many brethren into the order. And so Francis has a great grace that happens there. He even establishes a friary right there at St. James Compostela, just down the block from the great shrine. And Brother Giles used to love to go to the shrine there and really experience the beauty of God's grace there. All right, we're going to come back in our next segment. We'll talk about the Fourth Lateran Council in the year 1215 and the events of that council and Francis's presence in that council and what Francis took from that council and how Francis really became a man of the Fourth Lateran Council. May God bless you and may it keep you.